So it's Martin Kiernan here, and I'm at the ECCMID meeting, just looking around the posters, and bumped into an old friend, Sharon Bamber. And Sharon's a clinical scientist. What's your official job title, Sharon?
I am actually a clinical scientist.
You're actually
now.
a clinical scientist,
yeah. I'm also a HSST trainee as well.
So we worked together many years ago back in Southport, and Sharon now works at Wirral University Hospital Trust, but within infection prevention and control rather than in the laboratory, I think. And you've got a poster here because, like many organisations, you've recognised that you've probably got some ventilation issues in an older type of building, and you've gone about it by doing some CO2 monitoring, but in a fairly sort of low-key sort of way, haven't you? You've not installed fancy monitoring everywhere. So can you tell me a bit about the poster and how you went about it?
Okay then, so I'm a member of our ventilation safety group, so obviously our group were actually asked to assess the ventilation within our trust, which was actually quite difficult to do. And you can actually assess your ventilation if it's mechanical ventilation.
Yeah.
And we were aware that a lot of our wards and bays were actually naturally ventilated, so you don't really have anything as such to measure. And I was aware that some guidance and recommendations from NERV-TAG and also from the CIBC guidelines had recommended that you could use CO2 monitoring as a proxy to estimate how good your ventilation might be.
Yeah.
So, of course, you could put in the big, expensive, continuous monitoring systems, but across a huge trust. We weren't in a position to do that quickly. So we did purchase some easy kind of portable CO2 monitors in haste, but they were able to do CO2 and they gave us humidity and some other factors, and they're actually there for air quality monitors.
Yeah.
So we were able to just we did an audit right across the trust, and it did take us quite a few months to do, given that we probably have on average 5 bays per ward.
Yeah.
So we kind of took a ward at a time, and we left these monitors on average for 2 to 3 days so we could get a full cycle.
Yeah.
Because the main mitigation that we had was in a naturally ventilated ward was window opening.
Yes.
So,
very high tech.
Yes, and obviously then you can't open them too wide either.
No.
Because we do have multiple stories within our trust as well.
Okay, so this is a multi-storey building rather than a flat building.
And it wasn't all flat, so we know, and depending on the time of year as well, we started it in the summer and we went through to winter. This is an update from the end of December.
Yeah.
So we knew the opening and closing of windows would be quite variable, and probably more limited in the winter as well. Yeah,
and possibly during summer, during dry periods, you maybe get potentially more dust coming in from the outside, contaminating the outside.
I suppose that is that potential as well.
Yeah.
But we thought, well, at least they're more likely to open the windows to let the fresh air in.
In fact, Jen and I found if you ask staff not to open the windows, they do.
They will.
So actually, the most effective thing to do probably would have been going around saying to people, whatever you do, don't open the windows, because staff will always do the opposite, won't they?
Maybe we'll try that next time.
Yeah, maybe. So, findings.
So the findings, there's probably over 135 different sites across the trust.
Yeah.
And we were looking for risk assessment really, because we knew that it was likely that we had poor ventilation in some areas, but we were trying to look at what our worst affected areas were so that we could try and put some kind of intervention in.
Could you predict what they might be by saying that's an older building, therefore that is more likely, or were you able to have a gut feeling about where you thought the ventilation might be poor?
Well, we kind of thought this was going to be in our bays because we knew we had mechanically ventilated areas in some parts, so we knew our single rooms had their own air supply, so we knew they wouldn't be a risk. But we knew the bays were limited to natural ventilation, and also since the original building design, they originally wouldn't have had doors on the bays, but they've been introduced since, so we knew that would have had an effect on the airflow. So these were the conversations that we had with the engineers and our engineer for ventilation as well.
We've got wards and multi-occupancy bays. How many people in each bay?
There would be between 4 and 6 people bays.
Okay. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you say originally it was all open, and I've worked in organisations like that where as you walk down the ward, every bay is absolutely open, and then suddenly we start getting norovirus outbreaks, so we think, oh, that isn't great, the whole ward's shut. Maybe we can shut these off and create closed bays, but of course we've not necessarily thought about the ventilation, and if you've only got natural in that area, if you've got a shut door, you've got virtually nothing unless the window's open. Is that right? Do you
Yeah.
think we possibly shot ourselves in the foot without necessarily thinking those decisions through?
I think absolutely, and I think it's only because of the COVID pandemic it's really highlighted how are our wards ventilated
Or not ventilated.
or not.
Yeah.
And for us, we were happy with some of the other areas. We knew where our negative pressure rooms were, and we had all of those validated, but it was literally the bays. Although to be fair, we did get some monitoring for single rooms, but that was purely by accident because of these monitors are mobile.
Okay.
So they actually moved with the patient on a number
When they
of
weren't necessarily
occasions.
supposed to, yeah.
But it was good as a negative control though, because you would actually see the graphs go right down.
And I suppose reassuring that your actual
Yeah.
mechanical ventilation is working properly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So, what sort of proportion of low, high, and medium risk did you actually get, and how did you define those as well?
Okay, so we were going off the nerve tag and SIBC guidelines. They kind of estimated that if it was less than 800 parts per million, that would indicate you had good ventilation.
Yeah.
And anything that was over 1500, that would kind of be more of a red flag that you needed to kind of a more urgent intervention. So luckily for us, 70% of our areas were in the green zone. And of course, it was very variable when you look at the cycles, because I kind of mapped all of the data, across 48 hours or 72 hours, and it would be very variable, and that you could actually see that when they closed the windows of a night, obviously all the levels would start peaking up until about 5-6 o'clock in the morning, which was probably when they were opening the windows again.
And to be honest, I've worked nights. What you tend to do is shut the bay door as well, so that the nurses outside don't disturb the patients. So you've got the double whammy, haven't you? The window shut plus the bay door shut. Therefore, no circulation of air at all.
Yep.
And that's when you've been getting peaks of CO2.
That's when we would see it. And other things that we noticed would be sometimes around 11 o'clock-ish we'd see a peak as well. And I think that was quite an active time on the wards when there were ward rounds. Sometimes it might be around meal times again, when there's a lot of people in and out.
Are you saying medical staff spout a lot of hot air when they're actually on the ward?
Yes.
Okay. I think that's what you're saying. Okay.
So in that case, luckily 69% at the time of our monitoring were okay. We had 22% that were in that medium range, so that was kind of between the 800 and the 1500. But those that were consistently within that range, we thought we needed to they were kind of higher up in our kind of risk
so they're consistent
mitigation.
rather than just peak and trough. Okay.
Yeah, and then there was 9%, which was 12 that had consistently high area levels of CO2. So these are the ones that then we, in place with the estates teams, we put in some air purifiers.
Okay. And what sort of areas were they? Were they consistent in their characteristics? Certain height, if they're in the tower block, or were they actually fairly random and just subject to local practices or inability to open windows?
Well, I think you've got to look at our trust building is probably over 40 years old.
Yeah.
And they would have all been the same specification, all the wards originally.
True.
But there will have been a lot of modifications over time. So before we actually did the CO2 monitoring, I first went and did a window audit just to make sure have we got windows that open or not. So, but I do think it was pretty random. Really,
Okay,
there was no
interesting.
kind of pattern, because we did wonder, would it all be the first floor, or is it the third floors?
Yeah.
It was actually quite random. But in terms of our risk assessment as well, we kind of looked at the type of ward to help us with that kind of risk assessment, because obviously we'd be more concerned about admission areas first as well. So, but luckily there were only 12, so that's where we put our first air purifiers, only as a kind of a last resort, so to speak, because we knew kind of full engineering interventions would be kind of a longer term project, and that's still in progress for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to get you over while you get a chance to do something a bit more substantial, which is going to involve investment, isn't it? I mean, did you manage to get investment for the air purifiers reasonably easily?
Well, yes, we got the first few in, and I know our trust has ordered a few more now. I mean, it's very difficult in terms of the type of air purifiers, because there's so many out there on the market, and obviously we can't actually verify that they're working, because these purifiers don't actually bring in fresh air, so you would still see the CO2.
CO2 still high,
but we're hoping it would just kind of reduce the aerosol
Yeah,
risk.
I mean, I think that's what most people tend to recommend. I know Kath Noakes talks about that. If you can't bring in fresh air, then at least you can remove what is in the air. So I think that's
Yeah.
a reasonable enough approach. I mean, have you seen any impact clinically since doing this? Numbers of cases dropping in those high-risk areas? I mean, I know you've only got a very small number of high-risk areas, really.
Well, to be fair, it was this data came from the end of December. So, and there was a bit more of a delay before we got all the air purifiers
Okay.
in. So we haven't been able to look back at that yet.
Okay.
But we are using the air purifiers in a different kind of scenario, as well as our higher risk areas. We do use it sort of for contacts,
Okay.
ray contacts as well. So we're yet to go back and analyse that data. But I hope I'll be able to follow that up and see,
Yeah.
if this has had any kind of
Yeah.
positive impact.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, this was a nice, and I know it wasn't easy because you have to have the infection control team going out placing all the monitors all the time, but it's relatively cost low to actually determine your high risk areas and therefore to take some action. So I think overall it's a very cost effective intervention, isn't it? And it's made a nice abstract as well, plus some nice discussion points about practice in opening and closing windows and whether we should just wall up walls that are actually providing ventilation, and did we do the right thing all those years ago? Because I've done that sort of thing without necessarily thinking what's the impact on air. But at that time we weren't necessarily thinking as the air as a major transmission mechanism. So fascinating stuff. So thanks very much, Sharon.
All right, you're very welcome.
Okay.